with us today. I was tasked with going through the report and presenting it in a high level because the report is a long report. What we will hopefully accomplish is more of an executive summary presentation to get the discussion rolling. As was noted, Palestine 2030 is the name of the report, looking at the decade ahead of us. And we've tagged this report in terms of a decade of clarity and renewal. And we'll come back to that towards the end of the presentation. And of course, we thank all of the partners at the bottom of the report's front page for their support. As was noted as well, the report is a result of an effort from 2017 to 2020. There were 12 professionally commissioned research papers that informed the various discussions that we had. Those research papers, as you can see on the left-hand side, I put a page of the contents of the document that has all of the source research papers, and I believe that's a value in itself for researchers or others who want to go in more detail because they are very rich papers and there's no way that one report can capture the value in all of those papers. In addition to the papers, each paper had a vigorous debate along with our partners who were organized these debates, and they happened in West Bank, in Gaza, as well as abroad. The diaspora community was part of this. Actually, Palestinians from all their geographic locations, Palestine, Israel, the refugee community, and the diaspora were all involved. And we must note, not in a representative fashion, but in a broad base of stakeholders which come from the various geographic areas. The report focuses on three, what we call moving targets and their impact on Palestine. These are three targets that have changed dramatically since we started our work back in 2007. And we also feel that they are moving so fast that our political community at large has not actually stopped to evaluate the changes in the reality as it relates to the Palestinian struggle. And those three moving targets are Israel, the dynamics that are happening inside of Israel, the region at large, and the international community. And I'll touch on each one of these now. Before that, I need to note that this report was supposed to be issued at the beginning of the year, and we purposely had to kind of delay it in order to encompass this entire peace to prosperity vision that the United States put out, the deal of the century as it was tagged. We believe that this was such an important document to bring clarity to the larger political picture. The US deal, as it's tagged, is an existential threat to the Palestinian national project. The Palestinian strategic response to this in all of the meetings that we had and the discussions that we had post meetings is that this Palestine 2030 report rejects the US deal of the century out of hand in its entirety. It is not a platform that we intend to engage in. And we believe not only does this relate to our relationship with the United States, but it has brought clarity from all parties, including the Israeli side. The next decade, the report portends, is that we'll be leveraging that clarity. If the last phase of the deal of the century and the acts that the United States took in coercion with Israel have brought clarity, the next decade will bring Palestinians leveraging that clarity, something that was very hard to get before things have all come to the surface. The effort concluded, this report's effort, in light of developments in Israel, the region, and the wider world, the next decade will leverage the clarity that has come to the surface from all stakeholders while we press forward for independence and freedom and realistically unifying and renewing the Palestinian national polity in all its forms to collectively define the way forward. Those are the last few words there are probably the most important. We do not pretend to be able to define or adjust the Palestinian national struggle's goals. But we do call for the renewing of the Palestinian national political polity to be able to define collectively the way forward. The three spheres that we covered, the first is Palestine and Israel. And if we look at the left, we can talk about some milestones that brought this clarity. The first is the basic law in Israel of the Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, the nation state law. This law talks about the land of Israel. The map on the left is one map on the Israeli government website called the land of Israel. We can pick any of those 6 maps because we have no idea which one Israel is actually referring to. One of them reaches all the way to Iraq. Also, we can see that the entire Oslo process, which deserves an analysis of its own, but one thing is very clear, that the Israeli moves along with the US have basically created an abandonment of the principle of dividing the land, partition, within a scope of a negotiated settlement with the Palestinians. And we can see all of these Israeli successive leaders and Palestinian successive leaders all were shunned aside by Israel, not coming forward 1 inch to meet any of the terms the Palestinian side could accept. So thus a negotiated settlement has basically been thrown out of hand from the Israeli side. We can see also that the last period of time has brought a right-wing Israeli government and society, not only government, but and society forward. It basically creates an Israel that consolidates as a Jewish supremacist settler colonial regime based on racial segregation, animosity towards the regional environment, and a rejection from Israel to understand or to dialogue with the region. And this is going to be detrimental for Israel moving forward, given they are part of the Middle East, whether they like it or not. They are not the 51st state of the United States. On the bottom right, we can see that famous picture where Netanyahu was calculating the results of one of the last Israeli elections, completely invisible to the fact that the Palestinian citizens did a tremendous job in getting out the vote and stating their agenda. Completely missed in the calculations from the Jewish Israeli political bodies. All of that together has culminated in what we see on the top here, which is an agreement between the coalition government in Israel, which basically is representing a very broad spectrum of the Israeli political society, agreeing to annexation. And that was kind of the ultimate act of clarity. And as has been said, it's almost a lose-lose for Israel, because if they back off, we have, and the European Union and all the congressmen that have spoke against annexation will claim victory, and that will create traction. And if they move forward with annexation, we believe that the international community also sees that clarity and will start holding Israel accountable. We're seeing the Belgian parliament, we're seeing the European Union talking about sanctions, things that were never heard of only several years ago. The second sphere is Palestine and the region. And our meetings amongst the various stakeholders creating the report focused a lot that this needs much more study. Each one of the countries that we targeted are actually a study in themselves, and we encourage people to pick up on this report and go deeper. But there's 2 messages that we would like to present from the report. One is that the region is absolutely preoccupied with its own internal workings as countries. I listed a few of those flags which represent the countries that are in turmoil or having havoc internally. Added to that, we have several countries, and maybe more can be added, but Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, this galaxy of countries which are proactively trying to normalize with the state of Israel. When you add that to the Arab Spring and to the movements across the Arab world from the community level, what the result is chaos that we're not fully able to capture in terms of how it's going to fall out in terms of its relationship to the Palestinian struggle. The third and last sphere that we focused on is Palestine and the world. If I start at the top left here, There's a liberal capitalism move globally that has made the poor poorer and the rich richer. And these interests that are based within this capitalism mode of operation has brought havoc in many parts of the world, and maybe even in the US today, as we can see. We've also seen the past decade with much more military intervention, whereas at one point in history, the powers to be needed proxies to intervene militarily in the region. Today, those powers to be, whether it's the United States or whether it's Russia or others, are, as they say, have their own boots on the ground. And that has changed the dynamic. It also changes the dynamic in terms of how important Israel is to those powers to be. Of course, as always, the economic interests cannot be ignored. Our region being rich with economic interests for powers to be will constantly remain a target for their intervention to safeguard their economic interests. And then lastly, we have what we're all facing today, which is the pandemic of Corona. And this has revealed and brought clarity to a lot as well, including some of those powers to be that up until now have had bragging rights about being so proper in their approach to crisis, collapsing amongst themselves. In all, we termed what is happening on the global scene as a rewriting of the rules. So we see ourselves now as defending the Palestinian struggle, not only for the sake of Palestinians, but for the sake of safeguarding a rules-based world. And in that approach, every country of the world has an interest to make sure that the rules-based world remains intact. Otherwise, we go to the law of the jungle. One other issue that came up repeatedly, and we wanted to make sure that we highlighted in this presentation, is the issue of the PLO and the state of Palestine. The Palestinian political agency, we believe, will benefit in the decade to come with absolute clarity and absolute renewal. What do we mean by that? The sentiment in our meetings was that it's very important to maintain and strengthen the centralized and legitimate representation of the Palestinian people, represented by the PLO. That was agreed to with a lot of discussion around it that I'll get to in a second. We also noted that the PLO must reaffirm its national and political role as the sole legitimate representative. What we mean by those two statements is that the PLO itself cannot take for granted the rallying around it by the Palestinian people. They must act. And here's where we put in very bold red, time is of essence. The never-ending hollow calls for institutional reform will be replaced in the coming decade with clarity and renewal in actual institutional reaffirmation, which is a prerequisite to advancing our struggle towards results. Back to what we said in the beginning of this presentation, that it is the people who have to decide where we go from this point forward. And the younger generation, and even our generation, can no longer speak about the PLO in sloganistic terms. We must see real renewal if we are to move forward in a constructive way. After these discussions, and again, they're very long discussions, and those 12 reports inform the discussion, so there's a lot more than what I'm presenting here. And it was very hard to take all of the discussions and produce 3 scenarios that we called nurturing hope and creating change. These 3 scenarios, and I'm sure we can produce others as well, but these were the ones which were more prominent in our discussions. The first one is reciprocity. And here we mean that we no longer turn a blind eye to acts of Israeli colonialism and violations of our human rights. If at a period of time, because of a peace process, some things were put on the back burner in hopes that, and in good faith, that these negotiations may lead to something, now that they have collapsed, now that there is total clarity on the political scene with the deal of the century, we believe that it is no longer in our interest to turn a blind eye to any act of colonialism, whether it's the upcoming annexation or the ones that happened before it, because this is just another act of annexation. The second scenario that was produced is what we called renewal. Again, we did not venture out to change Palestinian strategy or to produce a strategy. We discussed scenarios in a strategic context, ultimately that will have to be decided by the political agency, representative of people everywhere in our Palestinian reality, to be able to move forward. This renewal option, number 2, basically states that we must build capacity, better capacity, more streamlined capacity, more professional capacity, in order to impose our national independence. We do not have an army to impose it militarily, but here we mean to impose it both in terms of diplomatically, in terms of our bilateral relations with other countries, and to impose it with civil nonviolent resistance on the ground to make it heard that we are aiming for Palestinian statehood and we're not going to change our path until the Palestinians come together and decide collectively to do so. And the third option that we produced from our discussions was that the Palestinians will come full circle. And this is sometimes classified as the one-state solution or the one-state reality that we're living in today. It is one decolonized state. Call it Israel, call it Palestine, call it XYZ. But the idea here is that rights will overwhelm any need for national independence per se. We put a footnote at the bottom here basically saying at different times, different components of these 3 scenarios may be mixed together. Again, we do not pretend to be the body that can actually define the way forward. We can define tracks that will take us forward, and these are 3 of the many that could be decided. Ultimately, and we end here, that everything starts with the Palestinian people. All options are available. Those who were portraying in our society that by military means we can gain independence have failed up until now. Those that have negotiated with Israel for over 2 decades have failed up until now. It is time to come back to the Palestinian people and see how we would like to move forward collectively. All options are available, both politically and in the tools that we use to achieve our goals. Again, the upcoming decade will be one of clarity and renewal. Thank you.